My name is Jamal Hakeem Rogers. I consider myself a veteran at Hills Academy because I enrolled when they first opened up. Now I am a senior. As a student here, I am taught not to only be a good man, but a godly man. Hills Academy has given me opportunities to be a leader, participate in community service projects, and live up to my full potential. I'm surrounded by positive males who look just like me. This has made a big difference in how I see myself and what I can accomplish. I am currently the president of Hills Academy Interact Club and have logged the most community service in my school. I will be the first student to graduate from Hills Academy and I'm very excited. In my spare time, I love to read and work out. I love to read so that my mind can travel even when my body cannot. It has opened up my mind to obtaining more knowledge. I am ready to show the world all my skills that I have learned and become the good man that I was always created to be.
Jamal passed away August 20th, 2021. He was 18 years old. He was a remarkable young man. And in his 18 years of life, he touched more people than most of us will ever have the opportunity of doing. He exhibited God's love more than most of us have ever experienced. In talking about him, I mentioned how he almost fit to a T the biblical definition of God's love. He was patient, he was kind. He was a lot of things to a lot of people. And his passing was not God's will. God's will. We have an interesting relationship with what we call God's will, don't we? We don't really understand what it even is. We don't understand what it means for us. Is it fate? Is it destiny? Is it an unstoppable force pushing us forwards towards whatever it is that God wants for us? Is it simply the desires that God has for us? The things that he wants us to do with our lives? Some call it the plan. You've all heard that before. This is part of God's plan for you. And we take comfort in that. Whatever happens, it is part of God's plans for us. It's part of God's will. And when tragedy happens, we can take comfort in the idea that there is a greater plan that we can't see or understand. There is a purpose to what we are going through. And if that is how you feel about tragedies, I have no intention of taking that comfort away from you. If you have experienced tragedy in your life and need to take comfort from the idea that there is a greater plan in motion and that all of this was a painful step, but a necessary one, then please don't let me take any of that comfort away from you. But what I'm going to propose is that maybe there is a better way to look at the difficult events that surround us and a different way to find comfort in awful situations. But before we do that, we need to deconstruct the idea that it is God's will for children to die. That's an uncomfortable thing to say, isn't it? It is God's will for children to die. We instantly revolt at the idea, don't we? And rightfully so. How could a loving God want children to die? How could the will of God call for children to die? But that is what Jamal was. He was a child. At 18 years, his life has barely begun. And whenever there are unexpected deaths, you have well-meaning people using the same lines. God had a higher purpose for him. God needed her. We don't understand God's will, but everything happens for a reason. We try to inject meaning and purpose into tragedy to make it easier for us to process. But think about what we're actually saying in those situations. I'm sorry your baby died, but it was part of God's plan. That is a cruel God, if that is part of his plan. Let's apply the same logic to other situations. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced what is considered severe physical violence by a partner. 1 in 10 high school students have. This torn shirt that I am wearing today is not just a prop, it is a memento that I keep as a reminder of my own experience when somebody that I loved attacked me with broken glass. And following that logic, that everything happens for a reason, God wanted me to be assaulted, right? That was part of God's plan. That was part of God's will for my life. God wanted somebody who I loved to come at me with something sharp and dangerous. Over 17 million women have been raped in this country alone since 1998. And a third of them had it happen when they were children. But God's will, right? It's awful, but there's a reason for it, right? Some divine purpose to assaulting children. Almost 700,000 people in America alone have died from COVID in less than 2 years. Worldwide, that number is over 4.5 million. And in both cases, that number is considered a conservative estimate, in part because we recently found that the now disgraced former governor of New York lied about the numbers in order to keep the truth about how bad it was hidden and make himself look better. Our own congregation has experienced personal loss during this nightmare. I once even heard a pastor, thankfully not our own, suggest that the deaths of loved ones are designed by God to get us to a point where we have to depend on God. Your loved one's death was designed by God. It is all part of God's plan. I've always had a fascination with the Titanic. It was the greatest ship in the world at the time, and 2,224 people were on board for its maiden voyage. Over 1,500 of them would freeze to death in the waters of the Atlantic. The youngest person to die was 19 months old. Every single day, almost 10,000 children die of starvation. Every year, millions of children die of preventable conditions like diarrhea because they do not have access to clean water or simple things like soap. I hope these things are as difficult to hear as they are for me to say. I hope all of our hearts are breaking right now. So I repeat, is it God's will for children to die? Either the answer is no, and our hearts are breaking because the God that resides within all of us, their heart is also breaking. Or the answer is yes, and our hearts are breaking because we know that this is wrong. Well, I'll tell you now, the answer is no. These tragedies are not God's will, certainly not in the sense that God plans for and wants these horrible things to happen. It was not God's will for the Titanic to sink. It was not God's will for COVID to be killing our families and friends. It is not God's will for women to be raped or for anyone to be assaulted by their loved ones. It is not God's will for millions to be killed by the Nazis in World War II. It was not God's will for millions of Africans to be enslaved for hundreds of years. It was not God's will for 2,996 people to die the day that terrorists slammed 2 airplanes into the World Trade Center. And it was not God's will for hundreds of thousands of people to die in the United States' subsequent invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it is not God's will for children to be dying from starvation and easily preventable diseases. And there are some people out there, some pastors and religious leaders who dare to suggest that domestic abuse is God's will and you should just tough it out. But that is an evil lie. God's will is not for you to be attacked and suffer at the hands of people who are supposed to love you. And I would die on that hill if need be. It was not God's will for Jamal to die. So how did all of these things happen? Well, what if I told you that I am not the 6 foot, 170-pound man who stands before you? I'm not. I am secretly a 9 foot tall, half-ton alien scout sent to this planet to collect information in preparation for a planetary invasion. We're going to come and we're going to take over everything. The reason you see me as a 6 foot tall, 170-pound man is because we have a special technology that enables us to take any form or shape that we desire so that we can blend in and get our information finding mission, do our information finding mission more successfully. Now raise your hand if you believe me. You know I'm, okay, so we got one. I got a refrigerator I can, So we know I'm lying, right? I am lying. I have the freedom to look you straight in the face and lie to you. I actually am very good at it because I am a storyteller. So I can sit here and create an hour-long, completely random story out of the top of my head. I actually did it with one of my students the other day about the great jellyfish invasion on Jekyll Island, because one of the students asked about why there were so many dead jellyfish on the beach. It was because the jellyfish army was invading, and we were all given flamethrowers and had to stand on the beach with our spiked boots and defend America. And it's all a giant conspiracy. That's why you have not heard about it on the news. But we were there. You were all safe because of us. You're welcome. I have the freedom to say that. God isn't going to stop me. I have the freedom to walk right out those doors, to stop the sermon right now, to leave my job, to never come back. I have the freedom to go to a bar, to drive to a bar and get rip-roaring drunk and then drive home. God is not going to stop me doing any of those things. And if I kill somebody because I was driving drunk, was that God's will? I don't think so. I made those choices. I knew what God wanted me to do, and I said no. God gives us that freedom. A few months ago, an apartment building in Florida collapsed and killed dozens of people. Was that God's plan? Now, I don't know the complete will of God, so I cannot tell you in every single event in human history whether that was God's plan or not, but there are some key things we can be looking for. In this case, it turns out that several people knew the building was unsafe. The foundation was cracking. There were complaints filed. They told people about it. But safety precautions were not taken, and no repairs were ever made because it was too expensive and the building owners didn't feel like it. So that wasn't God's will. That was their will. How many awful things in human history have happened because of greed? What about pride, jealousy, hatred? When sin is involved, we can be pretty confident that God's plan has to deviate from its intended path. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight." So raise your hand if you can confidently say that you have submitted in all of your ways to God. Not even the person who believed I was an alien raised his hand. So we know that we fall short. Now, many of us certainly try, but we are human, and we make mistakes. Thank God that his will for our lives is flexible. So here I have a stick. This is how many of us see God's plan for our lives. It's rigid, there's a little bit of bend, but it's pretty inflexible. This is the everything happens for a reason version of God's will. Everything happens for a reason, so there can be no deviation. Anything bad is supposed to happen. Everything has to be lined up for God's will to work out. But what happens when enough force is applied to that rigid mindset? It snaps. Everything happens for a reason only works until your village is burned down by the local warlord, which is a real thing that happens in parts of the world. Everything happens for a reason only works until your children are starving because you can't afford food. Everything happens for a reason only works until your husband dies because you can't afford his insulin. Those are real things that happen. And these deeply traumatic and tragic situations cannot fit into an everything happens for a reason narrative, so the stick breaks. And when it breaks, it often shatters because there is no way that that awful thing could be purposefully given to us by God. And what we are left with is feeling lost and alone in a world full of lost and alone people. So let's look at this a different way. I'm going to set this up right quick. I've unplugged the projector. After the sermon, we would have no way to see. We could sing, but we wouldn't know the words. We wouldn't be able to glorify God in the same way. So God's purpose for me right now is to reconnect the power to that projector so that we all can glorify God. So this is God's will for my life. This power cable is God's will for my life. Now, certainly the most direct approach, if I submit to God in all of my ways, is to go straight there and plug it in. But I didn't do that with my life. I'm 31 years old, and I have made plenty of mistakes. Sometimes I go over here. God's will for me is over there, and I say, I'm fine. I'm fine with where I am. I'm fine with doing what I want to do. That person over there is kind of cute. I want to go talk to her. And, sometimes I get back on the track, and I'm going. But, I blew right past it because I wasn't paying attention. And, sometimes I double back. I go all over the world. I've been all over the world. I have done more things in my life than I can even remember. I have had terrible things happen to me. But look, I'm still connected to God's will. When something bad happens, something horrible happens, and I crumble, and I can't do it anymore, well, look, nothing's breaking because God's will is flexible for me. I can say, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And I can still come back and pick it up and keep going. And eventually, I can make my way back here and plug it in. Because no matter what I do in my life, God's will is flexible enough, and it's durable enough, and it can flow and adapt to circumstances and situations that are beyond our control, that destroy us, and normally would shatter us. But God's will is not that brittle. God's will can work through our windings of our life. I will never be so lost that God's will for my life is destroyed. If I had gone straight to the projector, it certainly would have been a lot faster, but God's plan for me is still there. Throughout all my life, God's will for me stayed true. So where does that leave us? We now know that God's will is flexible enough to work around our fallen world. But where can we find comfort in the middle of awful situations? There's a couple kinks in this that would have broken this version of God's will, but those were still awful situations. Whenever tragedy strikes, there is a couple key verses that always come out, and they should. They are comforting verses. Romans 8:28 is a personal favorite of mine. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose." And this is an important verse. In all things, God works. Not that God causes all things, not that God wants all things to happen, but in all things, God works. God did not cause the Titanic to sink, but from that sinking, we developed new laws and regulations around ship safety that have saved tens of thousands of lives. World War II was one of the worst events in human history. But from that, we have created a system that has resulted in one of the least bloody and most prosperous periods in all of human history. Concepts like human rights did not exist before World War II. It is certainly not a perfect system because humans are involved, but there have been countless improvements and advances that people couldn't even have dreamed of in centuries past. And even in the midst of those awful situations, individually, many good and heroic acts took place during these events. And God was there to comfort his children who suffered loss because of these events. If any of you have seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge, it is about a Christ follower in World War II who was involved in one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific. But because he followed God, he refused to take up a gun and kill somebody else that God had created. And so he was a medic. And he was shot at, and people tried to kill him, but he never took up a gun in aggression to shoot back. He saved dozens and dozens of lives. He even saved some lives of Japanese soldiers when he came across them being wounded. That man was following God's will. And in our personal lives, I imagine we could each go around the room and talk about dozens of ways that God has brought blessings to us out of difficult situations. In all things, even horrible ones, God works for the good of his people. God's will still makes it through. 1 Corinthians 2:9 says, "What no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no mind has conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him." For my own life, I can attest to this. I was in the middle of 3 wars and even more smaller conflicts. I have been evacuated 5 times. I have been a homeless refugee for 3 months. I developed PTSD when I was 6 and I was caught in the middle of a battle. I have battled depression my entire life. I have been in dozens of street fights. I've had knives pulled on me. I've had rocks thrown at me. I've had crowbars used against me. I've ended up in the hospital from suicide attempts. I have been assaulted by loved ones. But God did not cause those awful things to happen to me. He's certainly been able to do some good out of them, though. I've been to Greece more times than I can count. I know people who it is on their bucket list to go to Greece and just experience it once in their lives. And my family used to drive down to Greece to go to Walmart because they didn't have one in Macedonia. We would take day trips to Thessaloniki and walk amongst the ruins like it was a Saturday. I have hiked Mount Olympus. I've been to Kenya, Brazil, Germany, France, England, Turkey, Poland, Spain, Czech Republic, and many, many others. I've had week-long camps in the Swiss Alps, playing soccer in valleys surrounded by mountains and eating Swiss fondue for lunch. And of course, we had a chocolate fondue fountain after. I have had a life that many people would be envious of, and much of that has happened before I was even 18. I cannot imagine what God has in store for me, and I cannot imagine what God has done in your lives or where he is able to take you still. Another very popular verse in difficult times is Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This was prophesied to the Jewish people before their captivity in Babylon. Their kingdom had just been wiped out, their homes destroyed, their livelihoods gone, and many of their loved ones had been killed. Everything they knew had been destroyed. Times were bad, and they weren't magically going to get better. They had 70 years of captivity ahead of them. But throughout all of that, God helped them to prosper. In all things, God works. Times are hard now. They are hard for Jamal's family and friends. They are hard for people who can't work because they have health problems. It's hard for people who haven't been able to see their friends in over a year. It's hard to see the virus numbers going down and seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, only to have it surge back stronger and more deadly than before. It's hard not to be able to tell our loved ones goodbye. It's hard being a teacher and a building manager and a boyfriend and a brother and a friend and a son and all the other things that I am. And some people have all of that and are parents on top of it. It's hard hearing about all of these awful things in a constant barrage of negativity. And on some of them, I honestly do not see how God can work good in them. But how good is it that we have a God who can do immeasurably more than you or I can imagine? And God's will works in the midst of hardships precisely because it does not break. God's will can move and flow and bend and adapt and overcome. And in all things, God's works. So rather than take a look at the awful things that happen and try to inject purpose and meaning into them, let us work on taking meaning out of them. Jamal was an amazing man, and we all can take many, many examples from his life. We can love harder. We can be more patient. We can be observant and careful and pay attention to those around us. We can be good role models. We can be hard workers. And each one of us can exhibit God in new ways because of the example that we had right before us. That is what we should take out of his life. We do not need to be injecting anything into his death. In all these situations, in all of these circumstances, there's something that we can take out of it. COVID is difficult. It is exhausting. It is overwhelming. And it has shown me how interconnected we all are. What affects one affects all. And I, before COVID, considered myself a bit of a loner. And after being alone for the past year, I'm tired of it. And we all can take lessons and take heart in the good things that God is working in the midst of tragedy. And finally, I will leave you with this. Of the 8 Beatitudes we often think of, 5 of them deal specifically with those who are hurting. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And blessed are those who are persecuted. Our God is a God of the broken. And no amount of suffering, no amount of sin, no amount of hardships, no high a mountain, no great a sea, neither life nor death nor anything in this world can separate us from the love of God. Because in all things, even in the trials and tribulations of life, perhaps especially in the trials and tribulations of life, God works for the good of those who love him.